Hello everyone, my name is Wesley, this is Woo Can Cook. Today we're cooking up a Szechuan stir fry called mapo tofu. Mapo tofu, if you're not familiar, is probably one of the more super common like Szechuan stir fries. It's probably the dish that's most closely associated with the use of Szechuan peppercorn. Which, if you're not familiar with that, that's the Chinese spice that makes things numb. So kind of some people call it the numbing spice. So if you've ever had things like numbing chicken or numbing beef, stuff like that, that's all employing the use of Szechuan peppercorn, which I forgot to take out. All of those things we're going to run through and talk through how I like to use those elements in a mapo tofu. The version that we're making today is loosely based off of the version that my grandma used to make for me, which was actually like closer to a chili. She used to call it a chili, probably to get a bunch of 10-year-olds to eat mapo tofu. But the version that my grandma used to make is probably like pretty traditional. My grandma was from mainland China. But also, in addition to that, the version that my grandma used to make was also very heavily influenced by like American culture. So the way that she prepared it was also like super influenced by just the plain fact that she had to get a bunch of 10-year-olds to eat it. So it also like kind of incorporates some very common American traditional things to incorporate in mapo tofu. So today we're going to be using frozen peas, which is definitely not a Chinese thing, but is super common in Chinese American food. So I'm going to be doing that. And we're going to kind of talk through how I like to assemble my mapo tofu. So, if you have any questions for me, feel free to drop your questions in the comments. I don't know everything about Szechuan peppercorn or Szechuan stir fries, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful or entertaining. Or at least informative. If you are interested in reproducing this particular recipe yourself, I recommend hopping over to the YouTube channel, where I have been making a good habit of posting everything that I'm going to be cooking for the next maybe a week or two. That's up on the YouTube channel, so there's a nice schedule of things that we're going to be cooking. We're also live streaming over there. I know a couple folks are already watching on YouTube too, so that's a good place to be. In addition to that, I also pretty much everything that I cook on stream has an associated recipe video that goes along with it, including this one. This is actually the very first recipe video that I did for the Woo Can Cook series. So all that stuff up on the YouTube channel if you're interested in cooking stuff yourself, and not just listen to me talk or watching me cook stuff too. Okay, so as with many stir fries, I'm starting out by crushing and mincing some garlic, and next up I'm going to finely mince some ginger. You probably hear me say this on almost every stream, that the reason that we start out with garlic and ginger as the first two elements for so many Chinese or like almost pan-Asian foods is because garlic and ginger tends to be the two fundamental building blocks that we use as like a starting point for building out umami, which is the quality of flavor that is commonly associated with not just Chinese food, but like pan-Asian food in general. So super commonly associated with things like Thai food or Japanese food, Korean food, all of those things very closely associated with the flavor of umami. So in the effort of setting up this nice baseline layer of umami, we're going to start out, as with many dishes, especially in Chinese cuisine too, with some crushed and minced garlic, followed by some finely minced ginger, and that's going to be the first two things that hit our wok before we start frying. So, do I grow my own garlic too? No, actually, although I'm guessing maybe the reason that you're asking is because my garlic looks very homegrown, I guess, or some might call it bad, which we can actually talk about too. So I inherit. Oop, lost the camera. Got lots of technical difficulties today. Sorry about that. I inherited some garlic from my mother-in-law. Well, I got it from my mom, who I think I got it from our mother-in-law. And my garlic looks like this, which has a whole bunch of, yeah, thank you, Dustin, thank you for pointing that out. There are a whole bunch of technical difficulties going on today. That's also why I was late today too, so I'm sorry for being late too. But if you're wondering why my garlic looks like this, where there's nice, like, sprouts coming out. That's because this garlic's really old. I inherited it from my mother-in-law, or I inherited it from my mom, who inherited it from my mother-in-law. So that's what happens when garlic starts going bad. It's not actually going bad. That's not actually like not an accurate expression. What's happening is the garlic is starting to sprout, and that's essentially the byproduct of the garlic trying to grow a new leaf of garlic. That's not a bad thing. All you have to do is just pick that green stuff out. So if you were watching at the very start of the stream, you probably saw me split the garlic open and then pull out those sprouts. And all that's doing is just ripping out the sprout of the garlic that's trying to grow into a new piece of garlic. So if you wanted to, you could even take that, put it in some soil or some water, and you can grow some more garlic. I just have never really found a good reason to grow garlic because it's really cheap. It's like really easy to find. You can get it anywhere. It's really, really cheap. And more importantly, it's really difficult to grow too. So you need a lot of land. So not one of those things that I have gotten in the habit of growing. Mostly because it's just easy to buy. So. But yes, if you do notice that your garlic looks like this, where it has like all of these crazy sprouts growing out like this, that's a sign that it's old. It's not a sign that it's bad. Don't throw this out. Just split it open, and then when you crush it, just pull out that sprout. You can also eat the sprout, but I found that it kind of causes some indigestion, so you probably don't want to eat it. That'd be my recommendation, at least. Do you really miss going out from dinner? Yeah. How do I branch out with recipes? Yeah, totally. Yeah, I definitely miss eating out a lot too. We've kind of like split. Done a little bit of eating out. There's like a little bit of outdoor dining. Actually, outdoor dining just got shoved back down in California again too. So there's not so much eating out anymore. But lots of times what I have been doing is like splitting my time between, so every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday I'm here streaming. And also on Mondays I'm streaming on another channel. But when I'm not streaming here, usually what I'm doing is either testing out recipes, so writing stuff. So that's usually like other days, so Friday, Saturday, Sundays. If I'm not here streaming, usually what I'm doing is like probably testing out a new recipe, figuring out like whether or not it works, and if it does work, probably filming it. So if you see that I'm not streaming, that's probably what I'm up to. It's just probably tweaking a recipe. And if I'm not doing either of those things, probably the next thing that I have been in the habit of doing is making dinner with my quarantine pod, which is there's 5 of us in total, and that's just like been a good way of like making up for the fact that we don't get to go out to dinner anymore, is to just like make dinner for each other now. So at least for me, that's been my approach to like being stuck inside during COVID all this time. Definitely a weird time. It's super poison. No, it's not poisonous. It does cause indigestion though, so you probably don't want to eat it, but it's not poisonous. I've definitely eaten that part all the time. When I'm like super lazy and I don't feel like picking the green part out, I have totally eaten that green thing all the time. Probably for like a couple years before I even realized that it was causing indigestion. It's totally edible. But you probably don't want to eat it because it will give you a stomach ache. So just pick it out. Sauteed ginger, yeah. That's basically what we're going to be doing today, actually. So the way that I'm going to be preparing my ginger today, actually it's the same way that I use ginger and garlic to at the start of pretty much every recipe. It's going to be the very first 2 elements that go into our pan. So actually it's not a pan, it's a wok. And what we do is we call them aromatic elements. And that's because what we're looking for from garlic and ginger is the aromatic qualities that you get from it. So not necessarily flavor, but the smell, so the aromatic sense that you get from it. So when we add it to a wok, we add it very, very first, and it hits the wok with the hot oil. And that hot oil releases all of the aromatic qualities. So we're going to do, we have 3 aromatic elements today. One is going to be our garlic. One is going to be our garlic, one is going to be our ginger, and the third one is going to be the white part of our green onions. And those are the 3 things that we're going to add to our wok at the very, very beginning and release all of those aromatic qualities. And that's going to be like our super baseline level of umami. Good question though, yeah. So totally saute garlic and ginger. I do that all the time. Pretty much every recipe, actually. Right, yeah. Crystal, yeah. How's it going? Thank you for tuning in again. That's also reminds me, a couple folks have been asking me to do a tofu recipe, so uh, I'm glad that I had the opportunity to set up a mapo tofu stream. This is probably one of my favorite dishes of all time. Kind of goes back to like things that I've been eating since I was probably 5 years old. And definitely like the way that my grandma used to make it was very much tweaked in a way to make sure that she could get a bunch of 10-year-olds to eat this stuff. So okay, so for my green onions, I'm separating them. So right now I'm slicing up. These are the whites of my green onions. I'm going not too small here, relatively largely sliced, and that's because we want them to hold up in the wok heat when we add them with our garlic and ginger. So we're just going for pretty large slices here, and that would be the whites. And if you'll notice, I have also separated out and set aside the greens of my green onions. And that's because the greens of green onions are a lot more delicate than the whites of green onions. You don't want to treat them the same unless you really don't care if they just completely disappear. But this portion of your green onion is a whole lot more delicate. So I've generally gotten in the habit, I don't do this for every recipe, especially if I'm not using the green onions as like aromatic qualities. But I've generally gotten in the habit of separating, when I use green onions, of separating them and then saving these green bits, or the green half of your green onions, and using them as a garnish. So that means that our greens of our green onions are actually not going to get cooked at all. They're going to be the very last thing that we add, and we're going to add them right on top. So very important if we're going to talk about food safety. I'm not a huge stickler about food safety, which might also make me not so great in like a commercial kitchen. But the one thing that I do stick on for food safety is that if you're not going to cook an element like this, like the greens of green onions, make sure you want to be very, very careful that you make sure that the greens of your green onions in this case do not come anywhere near your raw meat. So my raw meat opposite side of the kitchen right now, and we're going to set this on the opposite side of my raw meat. And that's because it's not going to get cooked. So since it actually never gets cooked, that means that it will never have the opportunity to like kill salmonella or any kind of bacteria that might be growing in your pork, or in this case, turkey. What's the deal with tofu? How can you learn to cook it? Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. So I have tried a lot of different ways of cooking tofu. Just like generally like tweaking a lot of different recipes, and I have like found, especially with like vegetarian or vegan recipes, that the use of tofu is the biggest problem that I found with the use of tofu is that very frequently tofu, especially firm tofu, is treated like it should be meat, and that's a big problem because tofu is not anything like meat. Like people use it as a meat substitute all the time, but it's not meant to be a meat substitute, and that's why people think that tofu is so bland and like tasteless, because it is bland and tasteless. That's the whole point of tofu, is meant to be bland and tasteless. So that whole like process of using tofu as a meat substitute is the reason why there's this big misconception that tofu is like a really like boring thing to eat. When in actuality, like Chinese food is packed with tofu. Like there's tofu all over Chinese cuisine, and that the reason the preparation of Chinese tofu in Chinese food is very, very different from the way that you would see like vegetarian or vegan recipes approach tofu, where they like try and use it as a meat substitute. So like for example today, the way that we're going to be using tofu is very specifically not as meant to be a meat substitute. Actually, we're actually going to be using meat today, so this is actually ground turkey. And the way that we're going to be using it is as like an element or an additional protein that is meant to complement the meat qualities. So like the way that I look at it, I think of it kind of like the way that rice is bland and tasteless. Like yes, it is bland and tasteless, but it's meant to complement another thing. So you eat mapo tofu on top of rice, and on top of that is also included silk tofu. So it's going to be the very, very last thing that we're going to add, and it does definitely independently has no flavor, but everything else has flavor, and it's meant to complement all of the other things that have all of that flavor. So good question though. Yeah, that's one of my big pet peeves, is the way that like I see like vegetarian recipes treat tofu is like there's a reason why it doesn't taste like anything. It's because it's not meant to taste like anything. Tofu doesn't taste like anything by definition. It like doesn't taste like anything. So it's kind of like eating, like to me, it's like eating a bowl of white rice and complaining that that bowl of white rice doesn't taste like anything. Like obviously it doesn't taste like anything. It's just a bowl of white rice. All right. So many questions. Do I have to absorb the water in the tofu first? Not today. Good question, Crystal. So Crystal asked, if you're not watching on YouTube, Crystal just asked if you have to absorb the water in tofu first. So and that is something that I do all the time when I'm using tofu. On a rare occasion where I use tofu as a meat substitute, or if I use it in a circumstance where I'm adding it super early, then you do want to like drain out all of the water in the tofu. So if you'll notice today, I actually didn't strain it at all. So that's very good point that I should talk about. So when I use firm tofu very frequently, you'll see me chop up the firm tofu and then I'll put it in a strainer, and then I'll shake the crap out of it, like really aggressively bang it on the countertop, and that's to shake out all of the water. So we're trying to get our tofu as dry as humanly possible, and that's the reason that we're doing that. Is because when it goes into the wok, we want it to have as little water as humanly possible, so that when it hits the wok, there's very, very little moisture going on, so that like you can get a really good sear and really good crust onto the bottom of your tofu. In this case, this is going to be very, very different because this is actually not firm tofu. What we're using today is actually soft tofu. Soft tofu behaves very differently from firm tofu for the most obvious reason that it is very, very soft. So if I were to treat it like firm tofu and shake it really, really hard in a strainer, it would probably just crumble apart. So we don't want to do that today. So there is a little bit of water. That's going to be okay because this tofu, the soft tofu, we're going to add at the very, very end. It's going to be the last thing that goes into our stir fry. So since there's a little bit of water, that's going to be totally fine because by the time this ends up in the wok, there's going to be a whole bunch of liquid in the wok already, so that's going to be just fine. Mainly what we're concerned about is, especially this is also the reason why we add it so late, is that soft tofu is also really, really delicate, so when we add it to the wok, we don't want to be doing anything aggressive in the wok anymore, because so if you're still like shaking the wok really aggressively and doing a lot of wok stir frying, that stuff is going to immediately crumble apart, and that's those are the qualities of stir fries that you're might associate with where the tofu is just kind of crumbly, and you have all of this crumbled bits of tofu that's spread across your stir fry, and that's another big pitfall of how to cook bad tofu stir fries. So. Right. Let's see. Hello to everyone just joining. My name is Wesley. This is Wok Care. Today I'm doing a Szechuan stir fry called mapo tofu. The mapo tofu, if you're not familiar with it, is probably one of the dishes that's probably most closely associated with Szechuan Peppercorn, which, if you're not familiar with that, is the spicy flavor in Szechuan food that makes your mouth numb. So you might, in Chinese American dishes, might see the term numbing beef or numbing chicken. You might see those words thrown around a lot, and that's the use of Szechuan peppercorn. So mapo tofu, in my opinion, is probably one of the most popular Szechuan stir-fry dishes, because it's basically kind of reminds me of chili a little bit. Although I guess the version that I'm making today is loosely based off of my grandma's mapo tofu, and the way that she always made it was very similar to how she made tofu and also how she made pasta bolognese. That's my grandma. Anyway, if you have any questions for me, feel free to drop your questions in the comments. I don't know everything about Szechuan cooking, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful or informative, or at the very least entertaining to watch. If you're not already watching over there already, we're streaming on YouTube as well, where a couple folks are already watching over there. And if you haven't bopped over there and checked that stuff out, that's where over on YouTube. So every time I stream on Reddit or on YouTube, there's generally, almost always will be an associated recipe video that goes along with the thing that we're cooking, including the recipe for today. So we're streaming every Tuesday and Thursday, 6:30, Wednesdays at 6 o'clock, and every Friday there's a new recipe video that comes out. So last Friday we released a recipe for pad see ew, which was super fun, which is a Thai dark soy sauce noodle dish. Friday before that, we did Westlake soup, which is a Chinese egg drop soup. And the Friday before that, I can't remember what else we've done. But we've done lots and lots of stuff. Right now, we're like working our way through, cooking our way through a whole bunch of copycat recipes from local Bay Area restaurants. So the pad see ew we did was based off of a pad see ew from a restaurant here in Oakland called Nicha Thai. The Westlake soup was loosely based off of Westlake soup from a restaurant in San Francisco called Dragon House, which no longer exists. But I used to eat there when I was a kid a lot. And lots of stuff like that. So a lot of those recipe videos will move a little bit slower, kind of talk their way through a lot of the decision making that goes behind some of the things that I do in a recipe, why I add the certain things that I do add, why I leave out some of the more common things that are meant to be included. Just generally kind of talking our way through some of the decision making that goes behind writing a recipe like this. So if you are interested in cooking stuff like that yourself and not just watching me cook stuff, or if you just want to watch me cook more stuff, fun stuff over on YouTube, and I recommend hopping over there and checking that out. It is also last thing I'll mention is that is also the place where I have started doing this much better now, announcing all of the things that I'm going to be cooking over the next couple of weeks. So if you're interested not just in watching me cook, but cooking alongside me, which some folks have started doing, you can pick up some of the things that, pick up the ingredients that we'll be cooking, since you'll know what we're cooking ahead of time, and you can cook alongside me. It's always more fun to cook with other people because we can talk about all of the mistakes that we make. I know I definitely make lots of mistakes. Okay, yeah, what else? Oh yeah, last thing I'll mention right now. So we had a December subscriber goal of hitting 1,000 subscribers by the end of the month, and that was like way too easy. We hit that goal way too fast. So we're aiming for a January subscriber goal of 1,500 subscribers. I decided that earlier today. So if you want to help us reach that January subscriber goal on Reddit, it's the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen, which is youtube.com/woocancook. If you're watching on YouTube, it's the channel you're already watching on. All right. So back to this. Right now I'm cooking up, or I'm setting up the sauce for my mapo tofu. That was 4 tablespoons of soy sauce, 2 tablespoons of sesame oil, and 2 tablespoons of rice vinegar. Let's see. All 3 of those are probably the most 3 basic ingredients that you could find in your like Chinese pantry. So I feel like most people will be able to find that. That seems like stuff that you can get at like Safeway and stuff. Next, I'm going to add, this is going to be 2 tablespoons of Chinese cooking wine, or also known as Shaoxing wine. The original recipe that I wrote for this uses mirin, which is very, very similar, but comes from Japanese cooking. Oh man, this freaking camera froze again. Mirin is a very, very similar element that you find in Japanese cooking. And is essentially the same thing. So Shaoxing wine is probably, in my opinion, most closely related to dry cooking sherry. Mirin is a similar alcoholic element where it has a little bit of sugar, but is also derived from rice wine. So similar quality, different culture. Next up, this is going to be a single tablespoon? Yeah. 1 tablespoon of oyster sauce. I think I'm running out of oyster sauce. And if you do find that you're running out of oyster sauce, or if you can't find oyster sauce, as the name indicates, is derived from the fermentation of oyster. So if you can't find this stuff, or if you ran out like I did, I found that the next best substitute is fish sauce, which is very similarly derived from the fermentation of fish. So I'm actually going to add a little bit of fish sauce since we didn't have quite enough oyster sauce. And essentially what you're getting when you use either fish sauce or oyster sauce is a little bit of like sweetness and a lot of umami that comes from the fermentation of fish. So if you can't find either of those things, the third thing that I would use in replacement of those 2 would be anchovy. I found is probably the third thing. All right. Next up, this is going to be 2 tablespoons of doubanjiang, which is a Chinese fermented bean paste. If you can't find Gochujang, the next best thing, I think actually the original recipe that I wrote for this too calls for Gochujang, which is very similar but comes from Korean food. So another fermented spicy fermented bean paste, but Gochujang is derived from Korean culture. If you can't find either of those things, the next thing I would use would be miso paste. All three of those derived from fermented bean. Alright. And the last thing that I'm going to add to this sauce is some spicy chili crisp. Spicy chili crisp is really essentially just red chili flake that's been like fermented and soaked in oil. And it's just sort of like a nice little boost. It kind of reminds me of red pepper flake, but had like a little bit more, like just a little bit more of everything. Yeah, that's soybean. Yeah, totally. All right, and that should be it. That is our sauce. So we're setting that aside. If you've watched these streams before, you'll know that the reason that we do so much chopping before we head over to the cutting board is because once things enter the wok, the rest of the dish is going to start coming together extremely fast. So I would say for a mapo tofu, by the time once something is in the wok, it's probably going to start coming together within probably the whole dish is going to come together in like 5 minutes. All right, and the last thing I'm going to do today, this is cornstarch, and I'm just going to dissolve it in some water. We call this cornstarch slurry. I use this a lot in anything that requires a thick sauce, and that's because cornstarch is used to thicken sauces. It's kind of the way that you use like roux in French cooking, or just like flour. I think in European cuisine, you use flour a lot for that purpose. Or I guess in Italian cooking, pasta water, very similar. Grandma, not chili crisp, yeah. So if you're ever wondering, probably if you go to like Ranch 99 or really any like Asian grocery store, you will see like the term spicy chili crisp, which really doesn't like tell you much. That's just like a general describer. And if you're wondering which one to buy, because you'll probably find like 4 of the same thing, buy the one with the grandma, which is what I think symptomology is talking about. Is buy the one with the grandma on it because it's the best one. Always buy the one with the grandma on it. And then the other like insider Chinese tip that lots of people know, or lots of Chinese people know about, is when you're buying oyster sauce, especially if you're buying Lee Kum Kee oyster sauce again, you will find when you go to the grocery store like 10 different versions of oyster sauce made by 10 different brands. I think even Lee Kum Kee sells 3 or 4 different versions of oyster sauce. The one you want to buy is the one with the little kid on it with the pink label. And that's because it has like more oyster in it. So I think they call it like premium oyster sauce or something. Look for the one with this weird looking kid on it, and that's the oyster sauce to buy. Creepy kid. It's the teller. Alright, last up I'm going to do a quick marinade on my meat today. So today I'm using, this is going to be ground turkey. I've gone back and forth on using all different kinds of meats for a mapo tofu. I've definitely done it with, probably the most traditional thing that you can use is ground pork. I have definitely done it with ground turkey, ground beef, ground chicken even. Pretty much every kind of meat that you can imagine, I've probably done it. And I ended up, after doing all of them, landing on, I think I much prefer the use of ground turkey. Mainly because it's a little bit leaner, and in a mapo tofu where it's very, very heavy already, and there's a lot of like liquids going on already, I found that just having a little bit leaner of a cut is a little bit more useful. And on top of that, ground turkey a little bit more tender than like lean ground beef. So a good substitute for oyster sauce for shellfish allergies. I'm pretty sure that you can buy, actually I'm positive, I've definitely seen it. You can get a vegetarian oyster sauce, which is derived from, it gets very, very close to what oyster sauce is, but it has no fish in it whatsoever. So I think it's completely plant-based. So I've never used it myself, but I have heard from other people who have used it that it's almost undetectably the same thing. which is insane. Right. That is our ground beef, and I think we're ready to head over to the stove. Alright. So over on my stove, I have my wok. This has been preheating for, I don't know, 10-15 minutes now. Anytime that you're cooking on a wok, you want this thing to be as hot as you possibly can get it. And then that's before you add anything else to it. So you want your wok ripping hot before you start using it. Yeah, that was, sorry, good question. That was 4 tablespoons of soy sauce, and then that was just a pinch of salt. So a very, very simple marinade. We're really not doing much to this that's because the sauce for a mapo tofu is really, really heavy already. So you really don't need to do much. I have even toyed around with just throwing the meat in with no marinade at all, and it works just fine too. So you really don't need to do anything super complicated. So yeah, just a little bit of soy sauce, pinch of salt, and then we're gonna stop there. Official, yeah, 3 camera setup. Actually, it's 6 cameras, so because we're doing the exact same thing on YouTube, so it's actually 6 cameras. I guess I should say it one more time. My name is Wesley. This is Wok Care. Thank you all for tuning in and checking out this stream. I love streaming on Reddit, and I also love streaming on YouTube. I actually love streaming for you guys. Today we're cooking a mapo tofu, or a spicy Szechuan stir fry called mapo tofu. The version that I'm making today is a recipe that I wrote that's very, very loosely an attempt at recreating my grandma's mapo tofu, which I don't think it even really comes that close to nailing my grandma's mapo tofu. I have no idea what she was putting in it. The last time I ate my grandma's mapo tofu, I was probably 12 years old, so I don't really remember it super well. But the version that I'm making today, since it's driving towards recreating my grandma's mapo tofu, incorporates some American qualities to it, and that's because my grandma, well, born in China, was cooking for 10-year-olds who grew up in America. So today I'm going to be using frozen peas, which is definitely not a traditional Chinese thing to do, but it is definitely something that you can do to make a bunch of 10-year-olds eat mapo tofu. So. If you're interested in recreating what I'm cooking today, pretty much everything that I cook on stream has an associated recipe video that goes along with it, including this particular stream. And that is all on YouTube, which is at youtube.com/wokcarecook. So if you're interested in recreating what we're cooking today, I definitely recommend hopping over to YouTube, checking some of that stuff out. Alright, so on my wok, I have a very, very hot wok, and I'm adding my oil to it first. And this in Chinese cooking is a process that we call a long yao, which is adding cold oil to a hot wok, which gets us a very, very nice non-stick surface going here. And then I'm starting with my garlic, going in first, followed by my ginger, and the whites of my green onions. So those are my 3 aromatic elements. And we're going to let this go just long enough until they become fragrant. So use your nose at this point and stop when you start to smell garlic, ginger, and onion. So for me, that's usually about 10-15 seconds. Alright, next up I'm adding my ground meat to the pan. So this is my turkey going in. And really at this point we're just trying to make sure that we don't have any large clumps of turkey stuck together. So I'm really just trying to make sure that everything is broken down properly. Alright, so right off the bat, I'm noticing that there's not a lot of sizzling happening in my wok right now. To me, that's an indicator that my wok is not hot enough. Maybe because I didn't preheat it long enough. So I'm going to stop moving it, and I'm going to give it maybe 30 seconds to build up a little bit more heat before I start continuing to stir fry. Because if you don't, and you do hear that happen in your wok, on your own stir fries, that's an indicator that you're well on your way to a very, very soggy and mushy stir fry, so you want to stop. Kenji, upcoming book. I didn't know he was, or I guess I did know he was doing another book. I knew about Every Night is Pizza Night, and I have also read the Food Lab book, but I didn't know about he was doing another book. But that's really cool. I will probably check it out as soon as it comes out. Kenji Lopez, one of my favorites. All right, so if we're listening, have a little bit more sizzling coming together here, so I'm a little bit more confident that I have a little bit more heat going on here. But if at any point you hear in your wok that there is a significant lack of sizzling, that's a sign that you don't have enough heat, so you should stop. That has certainly happened to me all the time, especially when I forget to turn up the heat hot enough. All right. Hello from Kansas. Yeah, hello from Oakland. Thanks for tuning in. Next up, I'm adding my tofu to the wok. So Crystal, if you're still watching, this is the part where you mentioned if I was worried about moisture entering the wok. I'm not super worried at this point because at this point we're pretty much done cooking. Mapo tofu is very, very simple. And that is pretty much all of the stir frying I'm going to be doing. So if you watch, the next thing we're adding is our sauce. And at this point, there's a whole bunch of moisture in the wok anyway. So we really don't need to worry at this point about building up even more moisture because it's pretty loose already. So, but since we are using soft tofu here, you do want to be careful now that the tofu is in the wok. You don't want to do any more aggressive shaking at this point because you can potentially start breaking that tofu, and you really want to avoid that tofu from crumbling to pieces first. All right, so I'm gonna let that go. I'm gonna let a little bit more heat come back to my wok. I'm gonna give that maybe a minute and just let some of that heat return. And then we might also cook off some of that moisture, and that's gonna be about it. Am I using a special gas burner? No, actually, it's just a plain old home burner. Great question, though. Lots of folks are worried about cooking using a wok on a home burner, but you can totally work around the use of a home burner on a wok by doing a process that we call batch cooking, which is essentially cooking certain elements and then removing it from the wok and then cooking another element. So the big concern when you use a home burner on a wok is that you don't have enough high heat to flash cook everything. So especially with the mapo tofu, you really don't have to worry about that too much because there's only two elements that you're cooking. Actually, there's really only one element that you're cooking, which is the ground beef, or in this case, ground turkey. So since there's really not a lot of stir frying going on, you really don't need to worry about it too much because I didn't even do any batch cooking today because at this point, we're pretty much done cooking. All right, last thing I'm gonna add, this is going to be my cornstarch slurry. And you'll notice that as soon as the cornstarch slurry goes in, that the sauce starts tightening up quite a bit. And we start going from a sort of a loose, liquidy sauce to a much more tight and cohesive sauce. And that's definitely like the thick, luxurious quality of mapo tofu that you might be familiar with. And the last thing that I'm going to add, and this, if you probably want to skip this if you're trying to stick to a very, very traditional Szechuan stir fry, but last thing I'm going to add is a handful of frozen peas. I think frozen peas, at least in America, is probably pretty common in a mapo tofu these days. I've also seen just like pretty much any kind of veggie that you have on hand. I've definitely seen the use of frozen corn, probably peas and carrots I've seen a lot of. I will say is if you are going to use peas, you do want to be using frozen peas and not canned peas because otherwise they're going to get pretty mushy. So the reason that we didn't par cook or even defrost our peas, I actually just took them straight from the freezer and threw them straight in, is because they're going to defrost in the stir fry. So, and that's because if we let it defrost before it went into the stir fry, then it would end up just turning into mushy peas, which is not what we're after. Just gonna throw the rest of these in. I'm adding a pinch of salt. That should be it. All right, so the last thing that you want to do every time that you use a wok, anytime that you use a wok, is remove everything from the wok and then immediately clean it, especially if you're using, like I am today, a carbon steel wok. The wok will definitely start oxidizing if you leave something this moist, this liquidy in the wok. So what I'm going to do, I don't have a camera on the sink, but I'm just giving it a rinse. And since our wok has such a nice non-stick surface to it, everything just rinses right off. So I have started saying this, I feel like, in every stream now, but if I had waited until I finished eating to do this, all of that stuff that was left behind would have definitely just started sticking to the wok. And then we would have had to go through this whole process of scrubbing it off. And if you're scrubbing on a carbon steel or especially cast iron, if at any point you find yourself scrubbing, this is not where you want to be, because when you start scrubbing, then you start running the risk of scrubbing your seasoning off. So there's a few tricks. I definitely have had stuff stuck to my wok before. But if you do find yourself scrubbing, I found that scrubbing with a wooden spoon works really well, or also just using salt and using the abrasiveness of salt will work really well too. But definitely, if you find that you have to scrub your wok, you're running the risk of you might actually end up scrubbing the seasoning off of your wok, which is not what we want to do. So proper wok care. Clean that stuff before you eat. Should be the very last thing that you do. So I gave it a rinse, and then I'm just taking the paper towel and getting this residual stuff off. And then I'm adding, this is going to be a very small amount, so maybe a tablespoon of oil to my wok. And then just coating the wok with a bit of oil. And very important, always remember to flip the wok over and do the opposite, the outside too. So the reason that we have to season or coat our woks in oil is not just for cooking service, it's also to make sure that we don't it's also make sure that the wok doesn't start oxidizing. So if you don't season the outside of the wok might start rusting too. So definitely proper wok care. Make sure that you clean that stuff before you finish cooking. How do you season your new wok? Great question. I think in my experience, I've messed around with a whole bunch of different things. In my experience, the best way to season it is to just start cooking on it. And stuff will probably start sticking to it at the very beginning. But over like maybe the course of like 5 or 6 uses, it will stop sticking over time. So definitely when I first started using this wok, everything stuck to it. And I came pretty close to throwing it out because I could not get stuff to stop sticking to it. And it was super frustrating. But probably over like maybe 5 or 6 uses, it eventually stopped sticking. And that's just like, in my experience, the easiest, best way to season a wok, just use it. But you will also find like all other kinds of like tricks to get a wok to be seasoned properly. I know Kenji Lopez did a whole YouTube video about how to properly season a wok without actually cooking on it. I have never had any luck with that. I definitely have seen things like you coat it in oil and then you bake it in the oven at like 500 degrees or something. That might be for cast iron only. I'm not actually sure if that works for carbon steel. But all of those tricks, they never work for me. Really, like for me, the best way to get a wok to season is just start cooking on it, and it will season itself. Any wok recommendations? Yeah, actually. So the wok that I'm using, I got mine at the corner store. It's just from a restaurant supply store. I think I got it for like $10. But some folks have asked me for good recommendations, and I know that the Joyce Chen wok is available on Amazon. You can buy it on Amazon for like, I think 20 or 30 bucks. And I've heard a lot of good things about that wok. Just make sure that you get the carbon steel one. I think they also make a non-stick one, which is not the one you want. Make sure you get the carbon steel one. All right. Lastly, I'm going to, this is some Szechuan peppercorn. This is probably the most important element of your spicy Szechuan stir fry, is your Szechuan peppercorn. And I'm grinding this up in a mortar and pestle. And that's just to release some of that capsaicin. If you're really committed, you can also dry toast these in your wok, and I'm not going to do that because I'm lazy. And then we're just going to add that on top. I've messed around with a bunch of different ways of using Szechuan peppercorn. I've also tried adding it a little bit earlier, but I found that adding it really, really late, like at the very, very end, and just letting it make contact with that finished cooking oil will really just open up those flavors on their own. And then I'm finishing this off with the greens of my green onions. It might be too much green onions, but it'll be fine. And that is it. All right. That is it. So that's my mapo tofu, which is actually my grandma's mapo tofu, which is kind of close to my grandma's mapo tofu. The version that we made today, since it has peas in it, is definitely not a super traditional mapo tofu, although I would say other than the peas, it's probably pretty traditional, although we did use some subs today. The version that I did on my recipe, the original recipe that I had written, was used a bunch more substitutes. So I think on the version that I had written for YouTube, I used Gochujang instead of Doubanjiang. I also used mirin instead of Shaoxing wine, and I forget what else. But there were a number of substitutes on the YouTube version. But that's, I feel like, the general gist of Chinese cooking is that you should feel free to make liberal substitutions, because there's a whole bunch of stuff to incorporate into Chinese cooking that you may or may not be familiar with, and especially if you don't live near like a Chinese or Asian market, lots of these things are probably a lot of things that you can't find. So if you can't find spicy chili crisp, just leave it out, it will be fine. Or you could also substitute it with red pepper flake, it will be fine too. If you can't find doubanjiang, just use gochujang. If you can't find gochujang, just use miso paste. Yeah, let's see. Thank you all for tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Wok Can Cook. If you're watching on Reddit, we're working our way to a 1,500 subscriber count by the end of January. We had a 1,000 subscriber count goal by the end of December, but we blew past that subscriber goal. So here we are. It's not January yet, but we're working on our January subscriber goal. So help us reach 500 more subscribers by the end of the month, and will be super fun. That's the YouTube channel. If you're watching on Reddit, that's the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen. Less people on Reddit, yeah, less people here over on YouTube than on Reddit. Definitely, if you're watching on Reddit, hop over to YouTube because it's a fun place to be. It's also where I have made a habit of announcing everything that I'm going to be cooking on stream a couple days beforehand. So I think the next 2 weeks of things that I'm going to be cooking are already up on YouTube. So if you want to take a shot at cooking some of these things yourself and cooking them alongside me, I know that I definitely take my time when I stream these things. We can cook it together, and then we can talk about the mistakes that we make. I know I made plenty of mistakes today, or I make plenty of mistakes when I cook stuff, and I feel like I made a couple mistakes today too. I definitely made one mistake where I forgot to heat the wok hot enough, so we had to do a couple things to make sure that we compensate for it. So it's always more fun to cook things together rather than just watching me cook stuff. Or if you want to just watch me cook more stuff, YouTube, fun place to be too. YouTube is also where I have made a habit of releasing the recipe videos that go along with all of the things that I stream on the internet. So this particular recipe is I think it was the very first recipe on the Wok Can Cook YouTube channel, which is pretty crazy because that wasn't that long ago. I think that was in like July or August. And that was the very first recipe that I put together, which was recreating my grandma's mapo tofu. So we have been releasing new recipes. Those are out every Friday. This Friday coming up, there is a recipe for Oh, it's a hack for the Panda Express Beijing beef, which is super fun and tasty. Might be one of the most tasty things that I have ever eaten because it's deep fried steak, so how bad could it possibly be? The week before that, last Friday, I did a recipe for the pad see ew from Ni Chao Thai, which is a restaurant here in Oakland. A week before that, we did Westlake soup, which was a recipe hacking a Westlake soup from a restaurant in San Francisco called Dragon House, and just generally like cooking our way through a lot of the food that I was kind of grew up eating when I was a kid. So this one of the things that I grew up from my grandma. Westlake soup was a soup that I used to eat when I was a little kid from a restaurant that we went to a lot, which was Dragon House. Ni Chao Thai, I used to live across the street from Ni Chao Thai, so I used to order takeout from there a lot. So things like that, all coming up soon. We also have another series that I've been doing, which is like hacking a lot of like Chinese American foods. So I've been making my way through, cooking my way through the entire Panda Express menu, which is why the Beijing beef recipe for Panda Express is coming up this Friday. And that's been super fun, and just sort of like deconstructing Chinese American food and seeing what like Chinese American food, what happened to Chinese American food or Chinese food when it came to America, and why does it look the way that it looks. Because like to me, Chinese American food is not like Panda Express is not really Chinese food anymore. It's really just American food. So that's really interesting to me, and like kind of deconstructing Chinese American food quite a bit. So if you're interested in stuff like that, I recommend hopping over to the YouTube channel where there's lots of fun content living. Also, lots of folks already watching over there too. So a fun place to be. Okay, take a bite. Yes, I can definitely take a bite. Let's take a bite over here. Yeah, very spicy. Definitely, like, the tofu itself does not have a lot of independent flavor. That's kind of like the general approach to the use of tofu in Chinese food, is that the tofu itself is not like really meant to be independent in the way that like chicken is meant to be independent when you add it to like a pad see ew. The chicken is meant to stand on its own, and that's why you do things like marinate it first, right? But in a mapo tofu, that tofu is really not meant to do anything independently. It's really just meant to be there to complement the rest of the dish too. So when you eat it and you like see lots of recipes use tofu and it's tasteless, that's because tofu is tasteless. That's like, to me, when I see lots of like vegan or vegetarian recipes using tofu and just kind of doing it wrong, that to me is like, well, it's because it's a terrible recipe. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you hop over to YouTube, check some of that stuff out. We're here every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 PST, Wednesdays at 6 p.m., and occasionally streaming on the weekends, although that's less consistent. But definitely Tuesdays, Thursdays, 6:30, Wednesdays, 6 o'clock, and then new recipes on YouTube every Friday. So if you haven't yet, hop over, check it out, and I'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Still weeks now. Might be over now, but I feel it still. Ooh, I'm a rebel just for kicks now. Let me kick it like it's 1986 now. Might be over now, but I feel it still. Got another mouth to feed. Leaving with the babysitter, mama call the grave digger. Gone with the falling leaves. Am I coming out left?